Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Listeners, some of you may recall back in March of this year, I decided to mix things up a little on the podcast by interrogating a panel of bookish experts about what they were reading. Because let's face it, as much as I would like to think of myself as an authority on what Australians read, the truth is my reading is mostly guided by what I'm doing for the podcast or events I have coming up. So it was then that I decided to chat with a reader, an author and a bookseller in an attempt to gain greater insight into reading tastes of the Australian public. I'm pleased to say that episode was hugely popular with listeners, so much so I've decided to do it again or something similar in any event. So joining me today is Cassie Hamer and Georgia Y. Cassie Hamer is a best-selling Australian author who's written 3 fabulous books: After the Party, The End of Cuthbert Close, and The Truth About Faking It, with another title due for release sometime next year. And Georgia Y, a person who spends quite a bit of time around books, I would say, in her capacity as manager for Hartog Warringah, someone who has done so much to support local authors in that area. Welcome to the podcast, ladies.
Thanks, Claude.
Thank you for having us.
Cass, I wondered if I could start with you. Not only are you an incredibly disciplined and prolific writer, someone I truly admire, but I know that you're always reading. Are there particular kinds of books that you gravitate towards when you're choosing something to read?
Yes, I would say that 80 to 90%, no, let's say 80% of my reading would be by female Australian authors. I do make an exception for the occasional male crime writer, and also for some of the really great female American literary writers like Anne Patchett and Elizabeth Strout. I'll pretty much read whatever they write. But I would say primarily there's just so much good Australian fiction written by women that I have no trouble spending every day of my life picking up a new release by some awesome, sometimes friend of mine, sometimes not, but I could read those sorts of books forever.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree with you more. And so do you have a comfort read? Is there something that you go to when you need reassurance or you can't be bothered to start something new?
That's a great question. No, I'm not a rereader at all. I feel like life, I'm increasingly aware of how short my life is and how many books I need to read before that life comes to an end. Not to get macabre, but honestly, sometimes I just wish I could impute a whole library worth of books because there's just so many new ones that I want to read. That said, I have occasionally gone back for inspiration to read maybe a little bit of Liane Moriarty, a little bit of Sarah Bailey sometimes, just when I'm needing that little kick of inspiration. Because I did have a writing teacher once say to me that if you have a touchstone book, like one that is super close to your heart and is sort of the gold standard of what you want to write, that is a precious gift. And there's no doubt that for me, that person is Liane Moriarty, and she's definitely the one who started me on that journey towards, lighthearted, but also with a darkish edge domestic fiction.
And how many books would you say you read each month?
Gosh, Claude, that's a really good question. At the moment, I think I'm probably getting through one book maybe a fortnight, but I'm also really getting into audiobooks at the moment. So I'm not usually a person who has 2 books on the go, but because the Northern Beaches Readers Festival is coming up in September, and I've got the chance to interview quite a number of authors at that festival, I'm having to up my reading a bit at the moment. And I'm finding that audio is a great way to sort of efficiently get through the books because I walk my dog quite a lot, and tonight I was cooking and I was listening to a book. So yeah, actually my reading rate at the moment is pretty healthy. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I want to come back and talk about the Northern Beaches Readers Festival in a little while because I think that's something that we all kind of have in common at this point in time. And I love that you're upping your reading at the moment. I feel like that's That's all I'm doing at the moment is reading.
Prepping.
prepping for that really big event. But anyway, we can talk about that a little bit more. Georgia, as a bookseller on the ground, so to speak, do you feel a certain responsibility, shall we say, to be reading widely and to be able to recommend or even hand sell titles to your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a huge part of the job and was one of the most intimidating parts when I was starting out. But you kind of do find this balance of reading what you really enjoy and then finding ways to get those books into the hands of people. And we're pretty lucky in that when something is successful, it tends to sell itself. So a sort of semi-bad habit of mine is that if something is really popular, I won't read it. And then I have this almost just refusal to even touch it because I'm like, well, I don't need to read it. It sells itself. It's probably not one of my finest qualities, but you know what? Some things just, they don't need me to read them.
Fair enough. And I'm kind of thinking of some titles that might fall into that category, but I won't say anything.
You name it, I probably haven't read it.
Georgia, in your beautiful store in Warringah Mall, and Cass and I have been there any number of times, and it's always so beautifully appointed and so well stocked. How much of your bookshelves would you say are dedicated to Australian titles?
Oh, that's a really good question. Thank you for the compliment on the store, by the way. It is always nice to hear. Gosh, I wouldn't even know where to begin with a percentage, but obviously we get our stock from Australian distributors and Australian publishers. So a good healthy portion of it definitely is Australian, just purely from an access standpoint. Like Australian lit is easier to get in Australia, but that's obviously a great thing because we get to do events and we get to meet authors and do all that sort of stuff. So I'd say it's definitely the majority, particularly within fiction. Although, I mean, yeah, you do get a healthy balance, but yes, it's definitely up there.
So in your experience, what are the evergreen genres?
Yeah, okay. So I would say that I've been bookselling for a bit over 6 years now. So not a huge amount of time, but a decent chunk. And I think you're sort of, from what I've seen, particularly in our area, because I think that's another important thing to kind of acknowledge is that demographics are such a huge part of what sells. I see it across our company, just with the difference, even in stores that geographically aren't that separated, how different what they sort of sell can be. But I would say, as Cassie mentioned, like the kind of Leanne Moriarty, that kind of family genre, like kind of, it has a little thrilling twist often.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be kind of like your Ali Lowe's, your Cassie Hamer's, obviously, Robin Harding, those kinds of books. I feel like it's a pretty strong genre, particularly for us. It's not too dark. And also it is a genre that is dominated, I would say, by female writers. And probably for us, at least, I would say we probably have more women readers and purchasers than men, although we do see plenty of both. So yeah, that kind of area of commercial fiction, I would say, is probably the most popular and evergreen, as you say. Then you've got things like what I fondly refer to as dad books. So that encompasses a little bit of crime, a little bit of history, those kinds of things, a little bit of like business, finance, self-development. Those kinds of things will always go as well.
A statistic, I guess, that is often quoted is that women are by far and large the most prolific buyers of books in this country. Would you agree with that?
I think so, yeah. It's hard, I think, to not feel biased as a woman myself. And much like Cassie, I heavily read female authors. It's a rarity for me to read a male author. And so then being who I am, that's kind of, I'm more biased in that direction to sort of notice those kinds of things. But I would say as individual readers, I think I serve and come across more female readers and buyers. And I think even if you look at, the events and things, we do a lot of events in our stores. I've seen both of you at a lot of them. It is a primarily female audience generally. In saying that, it has been predominantly, if not completely, female authors. But yeah, reading is just, I guess, maybe something that women feel okay prioritizing more. I don't know.
Cass, what's on your TBR at the moment?
I'm going to let you in on a little secret. A little birdie passed me a copy of the new Leanne Moriarty that's coming out in August. So I've had a sneak preview of that and I inhaled it. It's 500 pages and I think I finished it in 3 days. And that's while my three children were on holiday. So I was actually having to feed and attend to them. But just to give you, I mean, the blurb is out there, so it's no secret to sort of set the scene of what it's about. And it starts with a very ordinary woman, and she's on a packed flight from Hobart to Sydney. And at some point during the flight, she stands up and she starts moving through the plane, and she addresses each individual passenger, and she tells them what age they're going to die and how they're going to die. And some of them don't take it seriously, but I think even for those who don't take it seriously, it plants a seed in their head. And obviously it gains momentum because it seems like a couple of her predictions seem to come true. And so the story is told from this woman's point of view, Cherry, and there's a bit of a question over whether she's actually a psychic or not. And it's also told from the perspective of a few other passengers on that plane and what they do with that information. And it's so humorous. And on the publicity material, they've described Moriarty as a modern day Jane Austen. And that's exactly the vibe of this book. There's not sort of the high concept crime and intrigue of like Big Little Lies or The Husband's Secret. It's a little bit back to her earlier work, which is just very character focused and I don't know, just great domestic character focused storytelling, asking questions about destiny and fate and do we have free will, I suppose. So that one I've just done, I think it's going to be huge. I mean, it will be huge. Anything that she writes is huge. So that's a good one. And at the moment, I've just picked up the new Tim Aleph book, which came out last week that we went to the launch for. He writes great, gritty crime thrillers based around this craggy, hot journalist called John Bailey. And this one, usually he sort of writes about spies and espionage, but this one is a bit more, I think it's going to be about misogyny and violence towards women. So a little bit of a shift for him. And on the audio, I've got going a book by Justin Smith, who wrote one of my favorite books of the last couple of years called Cooper Not Out, which is about an amateur sports person who suddenly cracks into the Australian cricket team and just dominates. But this one is called Good as Gold, and it's essentially historical fiction that reimagines the origins of the Melbourne Cup, and quite different again.
I've not read a Leanne Moriarty book in quite some time, so I'm really looking forward to this new one. It sounds wonderful. It sounds almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Does it actually happen because you think it's going to happen to you?
Yeah, because everyone adjusts their behavior. Like this one mother is told that her child, who's a baby, is going to die of drowning at the age of 7. So she immediately puts this baby, who's not even a year old, into daily swimming lessons, and the kid just takes to it like a duck to water. So people are very fragile in some ways and resilient in others. And I think Leanne Moriarty just exposes those contradictions of human nature so beautifully.
Yeah, so well described. And I truly love Justin Smith's first book, Cooper Not Out.
Cooper Not
That
Out
was just one of my most favorite reads the
Yeah.
year that I read it. And Tim Aleph, yes, well, aren't we all just dying to dive into the latest John Bailey book?
Just a decent, tough, flawed hero. I know it's been optioned for screen, and I think that's moving ahead, but I would just love to see Bailey on the screen. I think it'd be just a good Aussie, tough, but with a sort of nice edge bloke.
Georgia, what about you? What's on your TBR at the moment?
That's a very big question, Claudine.
Have you seen the pile of books that's behind me?
It's honestly, when Cass said about realizing that you only have this finite amount of time, I feel that every single day. Working in a bookstore, you see books come in constantly and there's so much temptation. So let me think. Okay, TBR at the moment, I'm just about to start, or I've read the first page or so of a book that came out in the last probably month or so, I think, called Margot's Got Money Troubles by Rufi Thorpe. The premise is a little bit risque, so I won't go too much into it, but it's about this teenage girl who finds herself pregnant by her college professor and then has to figure out a way to make money to support her life. It sounds like it's going to be a raucous time. One of our book buyers recommended it to me, so I'll take her advice. And I just read, but it's not out yet, so I'll mention it, a book called The Pairing by Casey McQuiston, which is a romance, but it's about this couple who have split up and then by coincidence find themselves on the same food tour through Europe. So Casey McQuiston is a US writer, so it's perfect for the summer that they're having, but it will be the summer novel. I feel it's European food and scenery, and the romance is great. So that was excellent. And so that's one I think everyone should add to their TBR as well. Yeah, I literally have hundreds of books on my TBR, so it's just a taste.
Are there any current or emerging trends that you're aware of in the book industry that have surprised you?
Oh, I want to talk about this with Georgia too, because I'm wondering how much impact you've noticed of BookTok on your store. I'm sure it's a bit variable store to store, but can you also talk to me about romantasy? Because this is all I keep hearing about, and I have a mental block when it comes to reading fantasy and speculative fiction and dragons and vampires. I just can't go there. So I'm wondering if you have gone there and whether I should go there and where should I start?
Okay, I definitely can speak to this. BookTok, huge. We first kind of saw it a couple of years ago when Colleen Hoover really blew up here, which has now subsided. But yes, romantasy is very much the current thing. And sort of romance in general as a genre has lifted a lot. But yeah, romantasy, I think what I will say is, while it is romance fantasy, I think the romance part of it makes it very accessible for someone that's not your traditional fantasy reader. And part of the reason I think it's gotten so popular, as well as obviously the fact that everyone's talking about it, is that I feel like a lot of us in childhood read fantasy books, and then you sort of hit a point where you go, oh no, I'm not really into that anymore. And you start reading, literary or teen or whatever. That's certainly what happened to me. And you kind of, in a lot of cases, I think it's this mental block that you get about fantasy, even though, we engage with it in movies and things like that. And so I think part of it is because of the romance element, which is familiar, readers are tapping back into this kind of childlike appreciation of fantasy and fantastical worlds, but the romance makes them able to put it onto something that they can understand, if that makes sense. And it makes, all of the world building and stuff like that a little bit more accessible because you've got this romance plot that's pulling you through the story, so you don't get bogged down in too much detail. So I think that's part of why it's been so popular.
And which is the best one that you've read? Where would a beginner romantasy reader start, do you think? I've heard a lot about Fourth Wing. Is that sort of the grandmother of it all?
Fourth Wing, I would say, is probably where we saw it explode, but something like A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. It's one of those series that kind of sits between teen and adult. It's an in-between one. And that's a series that is that kind of romantasy type thing that has been out for quite a long time, but I think is a lot of people's kind of gateway as well. To be honest, it's not a genre that I've read a lot of. I'm more of like a fantasy or a romance person. And as previously stated, once something gets popular, I refuse to read. So I'm very guided by kind of what we see selling and stuff like that. But I would say Fourth Wing or A Court of Thorns and Roses is probably a good place to start. But I'm trying to think, The Branded by Jo Riccioni, who's another local author. I think, I haven't read it myself, but is fantasy, and I think potentially has a bit of that romance element. Because so many of these reads, and particularly when it's coming from BookTok, we see so many particularly American, sometimes UK, titles get massive, which is great. The more people are reading, the better. But it is sad that often Australian authors don't reach that same kind of audience. And it's sadly not something that can be engineered. So it just kind of is what it is.
I love that you were able to give us those recommendations for people who might want to start in that genre, because romance is really having a heyday at the moment, I feel. Rom-com in particular. I mean, I'm thinking of a local author by the name of Amy Hutton who's doing so very well. And I recently read another rom-com by She's an expat Australian. She's living in Austria at the moment, Lizzie Dent, who is actually Rachel Johns' cousin, believe it or not. And she's got a new book that has just come out, I believe, and it's called Just One Taste. And honestly, it was divine. Really lovely recommendations. So thanks for that, Georgia.
I think it's really nice to see as well because, and I think this is a bit of a credit to how popular it is online, these genres that have often been perhaps like looked down upon or seen as not as serious because they're mostly read by women. Let's face it, it's a misogyny issue. But they're getting this kind of platform and this readership, which is just awesome. And everyone's saying, you know what? It's fun. What is reading for if not to learn and enjoyment? They're like the two main things, I think. So it's really nice to see.
I couldn't agree with you more. So very well said, Georgia. Now, Cass, as I mentioned earlier, you have a new book coming out next year with your publisher, Harlequin. Can you tell us anything about it?
Yes, it's called The Stranger at the Table, and it's going to be out at the moment. The plan is that it will be out in April, and it's a work of domestic suspense. And it's about a woman who's a mother of two and a piano teacher, very normal sort of woman. But she moves from Newcastle with her husband and kids to Sydney to make a fresh start because she's trying to escape from an awful, awful mistake that she's made in her past, a mistake that cost 2 lives and also landed her in jail. But it was a crime that she can't actually remember because she is an alcoholic, and she's trying to piece together parts from the day of that accident without being able to fully understand what happened. At the same time, she's putting huge pressure on herself to produce the perfect Christmas because she's been absent from her children's lives for nearly 2 years, and she feels that she really owes it to them to give them something perfect. But in the midst of all that, her mum, God bless her, decides to invite a stranger to Christmas. But this person isn't quite the stranger that they think that he is. And in fact, that stranger is going to hold the key to our main character sort of exploding her past and a whole heap of family secrets just coming to a massive climax on Christmas lunch, and may or may not end with someone dead.
Oh, my goodness.
As if Christmas isn't already stressful enough.
Exactly. That's what it came from. It's me sitting around at Christmas just feeling like I wanted to kill someone because it is so much stress and pressure for women, mothers in particular. You know, people talk about the magic and the spirit of Christmas. Well, the magic of Christmas is an overworked woman who feels like the world is going to end unless she can really deliver on the perfect Christmas for her kids. So that was definitely part of the inspiration behind it.
Oh, it does sound truly wonderful, Cass. I can't wait for that to come out and for listeners and your fans to be able to read another Cassie Hamer novel.
Oh, thanks, Claude. That's very kind of you to say.
Now, Georgia, Cass mentioned it earlier. You know, we're all looking forward to the Northern Beaches Readers Festival in September of this year. And Harry Hartog's Warringah is the official and exclusive bookseller for this year's festival, which we're all hugely, hugely excited about. So I wanted to ask you, what's the thing that you're most looking forward to in that capacity?
Oh, it's just so exciting. Having been to Sydney Writers Festival and things like that, I'm just excited to be there and be a part of it all. There's nothing I find more galvanizing than being around people who read and work in the same industry and just kind of get it. So to have so many people that love the same thing in one place and to have it on the beaches where I've lived my whole life, and to have like these big authors doing panels and talks and things, my most exciting thing will just to be there.
One of the things that we as the organising committee, Cass, and correct me if I'm wrong, the thing that we loved most about the 2022 festival was the feedback that we got about how good the vibe was there, and people felt so welcomed. People felt it was a welcoming space. It wasn't just a space for writers, it was a space for readers. It was a space for readers and writers to connect with one another, and authors were accessible. Would you agree with that, Cass?
Definitely. It was, without doubt, the personal and friendly vibe was the thing that came through most strongly in our exit survey. 99% of people said that they would be back for our next occasion. And I think people just went away happy because you really do get an opportunity to speak one-on-one to your favorite author, get your book signed, have a little chat, have a photo. So that personal touch, I do think, is something that sets us apart from other festivals.
It's in the name, right? Like, it's called the Readers Festival, which I love that you guys came up with that, because I think, there is a level of it's kind of intimidating, the whole like writers festival thing. So to have a festival for readers it's a very welcoming vibe.
You were talking about the personal touch, and I think it's fair to say, Cass, that Georgia would know a fair few of those attending authors. And Georgia, you and your staff have always been incredibly supportive of local authors, and maybe even the not so local ones. You're always hosting book launches, and you always do it with a smile where nothing is ever too much trouble. Tell me about this, and why is this important to you?
Thank you, first of all. That's very kind, and I'm glad that that comes across, because that's always what we want to be giving off. I think for us and for Harry Hartog in general, community is a really important part of what we do, because we don't exist without a community. I think people have been expecting for years for bookshops to, go by the wayside because everything is so online, but community is what helps us survive. So I think authors put so much work into, creating their art, and it's really important to celebrate that. For a lot of the authors I've met, whether it's, their first book launch or their 15th book launch, it's just great to be there to see someone, present something to their family and friends and say, I made this, and to, watch them celebrate. And then I think for me, as a personal philosophy, I know that that's quite a nerve-wracking thing, particularly because for a lot of writers, they either also have a day job that has nothing to do with public speaking or anything like that, or they're a writer, so they spend a lot of time just solitary, and getting up in front of people can be scary. The more chill I can be, the better, because I just want them to have a good time, basically.
I can't think of a single time that I've been in your store for a book launch, and I've been there a lot, I think, certainly the last couple of years. I cannot think of a single time in which we haven't all felt incredibly welcome and unhurried and very happy in your store. That truly comes across in everything that you do. So congratulations on that.
I'm very glad. I feel very lucky to do what I do. So that's probably part of it as well, is that I'm just happy to be there as well.
Now, this is related to what you were just saying, Georgia, and I think it's a question that both of you could, potentially answer. But at this point in time, one of Australia's leading online book retailers, Booktopia, has gone into voluntary administration. I've seen and heard a lot of concern about this in terms of what it says about the state of the bookselling and publishing industry in this country. What are your thoughts on this?
That's really interesting, Claude. I actually don't think it says a lot about the wider industry. I just think it says something about a business where perhaps a bit of the decision making wasn't quite appropriate. I think the issues there are confined to Booktopia, and there's no doubt that cost of living would put pressure on people's budgets to spend on leisure items such as a book. Not that I think a book is anything but an essential item, but I do admit that for many people books would be a bit of a luxury, so I'm sure there is a bit of a squeeze on. But I think one thing that maybe readers and listeners may not be aware of is just how lucky we are in Australia to have such a thriving independent book selling sector. It is something that, along with our public libraries, are something that's quite special and unique to Australia, where overseas, it's not so readily accessible. The market's dominated more so by major chains. So to have people like Georgia, like Harry Hartog, like other independent booksellers who you can go to and you know them and you get a personalized recommendation, that's something that's very valuable in our industry. So we need to keep supporting them. And I think most people know that it is really important. Of course, there are times when you're going to go possibly to Big W or Amazon, but it's also really important to spread your spend across our independent retailers as well, so that we can keep them thriving. And so when a big operator like Booktopia goes under, we've still got other options to walk into a bookstore and get a great recommendations. So now I'll step off my soapbox and let Georgia speak about her views on it all.
Let me jump right on it, Cass. Yeah, very much agree. This is my take on it, whether this is what actually happened or not. To me, it would seem that Booktopia had this huge expansion during COVID because they really benefited because people were at home. And so people like us and other people who wanted to support an Australian business would spend their money at Booktopia because that way they're, supporting an Australian business. And I think they expanded at that point because they went, great, business is booming. But when everything opened back up, those people went back to shopping at their local independent bookstore because they could. And because, bricks and mortar is very expensive to maintain. So I think people that are looking to spend responsibly and want to support their local businesses went back to their local businesses. You're going to have people that shop online that are always going to shop with your giant online conglomerates like Amazon because it's cheaper. And those people aren't shopping from Booktopia. They're going to shop from Amazon. So I think that's maybe what happened. But yeah, completely agree with Cass that bookstores understand that, yes, there are often places that you can get your books cheaper, but we try to provide a community hub. We give recommendations. It's about so much more than just the product that you walk out with. So we appreciate anyone that comes and spends their hard-earned dollars with us.
I certainly did see the news of Booktopia's demise as more of an incentive for people to get behind their independent bookstore. Like you said eloquently, Cass, I think it makes us understand the value of having an independent bookstore network in this country. I can think of quite a few stores that I quite happily spend my money in, even though I know that I can get that book cheaper at Big W or Target or wherever the case may be. There is a place for those discount stores in the industry. I make it my mission to spread my dollar around as much as I can.
Bookstores are trying to support the authors as well. So I guess that would be my advice to people, is to think like, I want as much of my money to get to the author as possible. An independent bookstore is going to be the way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so do we have any final recommendations for books for listeners to maybe grab hold of in the next little while?
Great question, Claude. What I might do, I just want to preview one of the sessions that's coming up at NBRF, which will also include a couple of recommendations because it's really top of mind at the moment as I'm reading the books for the authors involved. And the session is called Fiction That Doesn't Play by the Rules. And we're speaking to three authors: Claire Fletcher, who's a rom-com author, Abra Pressler, who's also written a fabulous rom-com, and Justin Smith, whose book I spoke about earlier. So on the face of it, there's sort of three quite different novels, but what they all share is that all three of them do have a bit of a sporting focus, which is so interesting because Australians are truly in love with sport, but it's not something that we often see represented in fiction. And all three of these authors have done it, but they've done it in a very non-standard way because both Claire and Abra's book include a queer romance element, which is so fabulous and so interesting. And Justin Smith's book, The Cooper Not Out, that we briefly mentioned, also has that. So it's just going to be a really interesting discussion about the intersection of sport, romance, queer culture, something that I don't think we've seen at other literary or writers' festivals. So I am genuinely really excited about. So I would recommend all three of their books. So Claire's is Love Match, Abra's is called Love and Other Scores, and Justin's book is called Good as Gold. So 3 recommendations.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. What about you, Georgia?
Oh, I'll be listening into that session, I think. They all sound really good. Well, on a similar vein, a book that I would love to recommend is Language of Limbs by Dylan Hardcastle, which is a queer book that came out recently, and it follows 2 characters whose stories follow almost parallel. They sometimes almost meet, but they don't quite touch. And you follow them through a number of years in their lives. And it's set in sort of the 80s, I think, in Sydney. And so you get this glimpse into sort of like the AIDS crisis and early days of Mardi Gras and all these different things. But Dylan is just a remarkable writer. So that's a book that I would urge everyone to pick up.
I've seen quite a bit of press in relation to Dylan's book, so that sounds like something we should all read. I have read Abra Pressler's book, Love and Other Scores. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I've also read Claire Fetcher's Love Match. Loved that one too. Yet to read Justin's new book, but I will get there. As you can see from that gigantic pile behind me, I'm really struggling.
That pile could actually kill you, Claude, if it topples over.
The prompt for your next book, Cass.
Death by book.
What a way to go, though.
I was telling Cass before we started recording that I literally am moving piles of books from one surface in my house to the next surface of my house, just trying to manage the volume of books coming in. Unlike your beautiful bookstore, I don't have endless shelves in which to store my books.
Don't worry, my room is a disaster. There's like a path like this through. One part's just a pile of clothes and the other is just mountains of books. So
oh my goodness,
you're in good company.
Well, ladies, I think it's about all the time that we have to chat today. It's been wonderful to speak with you about all things books. Thank you so much for your insights and for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Claude. Great as always.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.